Hey, everybody. So I'm going to be playing most of Stephen Miller's speech from that Charlie Kirk memorial in just a few minutes. And I'm going to be talking about the messages that he's intentionally sending in that speech. But I want to say first that I think people are making a mistake when they describe that speech as unhinged. Miller wrote that speech really carefully, and he said exactly what he meant to say. And one of the main messages that hangs over that entire speech, you'll see this, is that America is not an idea. It's not an idea of a diverse group of people living freely with one another, that sort of thing, the way we talk about America. To Miller, America is a place, and it's a place that was built by and for European men, who he calls the civilized people. And it's a place that must be protected for their descendants. So the speech wasn't unhinged, it was un-American, but it was entirely the speech that Miller planned to give. And it may have been the most important political speech since the 2024 election, because Miller isn't just some fringe character doing what he does in the shadows. He's Donald Trump's deputy chief of staff for policy, and he's the nation's Homeland Security advisor. And of all the speakers at that rally, he's the one who's most responsible for the strategy behind Trump's war on American culture. So over the years, no one has been more responsible for crafting Trump's divisive us versus them kinds of political messaging than Stephen Miller. But it's not just his words anymore. Now he has the power to put those words into action, because this time around, he's part of an administration that has none of the guardrails that were still present during Trump's first term. So as we see the increasing brutality of this regime against the other, all of that, what we're seeing, is a natural and expected outcome of Miller's vision for America. And frankly, I want to live in a world where people like Stephen Miller don't get to define who our nation is going to become. But here's where this channel comes in this conversation. A huge number of the kind of people that I pastored for 20 years, my people, a huge number of them heard Trump and Miller's messaging loud and clear during the election, and they gave it a thumbs up. And most of them are honest on surveys, and they say that they liked Trump's messaging, but they'll defend their choices in public or in private conversations by using words that Miller and Trump have taught them, words about how they were really voting against the radical left. So this speech that we're going to look at today is a prime example of how that whole sick system operates, how people like Stephen Miller and Donald Trump weaponize the fears and the anxieties and the grievances and, yes, the cultural pride of traditionally minded people of faith. When I retired from pastoral ministry in 2016, I'd been a Republican my whole life, but when I learned that self-described Christians were the ones who were most eager to embrace Trump's message, that just made no sense to me. So I had to do really a deep dive for several years into areas that I hadn't studied before. And I learned that this is something that's happened throughout history. Traditionally minded people, and especially traditional religious people, have historically been the most receptive audience for some of these types of tribal appeals. They're very receptive historically to messages that play on their fears of losing their lifestyle, their fears of losing their right to practice their faith, or losing their place of preeminence in the culture. So all the rhetoric that we hear from Trump and Miller is really just recycled stuff from many different movements across the world over many decades. So for instance, this messaging that they're doing now around sort of the Sodom and Gomorrah nature of our cities, around the dangers of the other, around the friend-enemy distinction, all of those messages come straight out of a well-worn playbook, one that's really easily recognized by anyone who's willing to learn about this stuff. So those are some of the very tactics that Jason Stanley, for instance, outlines in his book, How Fascism Works. So in a minute, we're going to see very clearly what a fascist appeal to people of faith looks like in America in 2025. And I get it that this can be kind of a scary thing to talk about, because Trump is threatening to criminalize anyone who uses that word against him. But that's a little bit like saying, don't call me a bully or I'm going to pull your pigtails again. I mean, we need to use that word because it's accurate, but we do need to understand it. So here we go. Let's start with a very simple phrase that Jason Stanley used in the subtitle of his book, How Fascism Works. He calls it the politics of us and them. And that's the simplest way to think about all of this. But obviously, he's written whole books about the topic, so it does go much deeper than that. But if you don't hear anything else I say, just remember that. Remember what Jason Stanley said as you listen to Miller's speech. Listen to how Miller's entire message is all about the politics of us and them. That's his whole shtick, the friend-enemy distinction. The rest is really just details. So let's jump in and listen a little bit, and then I'm going to go deeper into the fascism thing as we go deeper into Miller's speech.
Hello, Turning Point. Hello, Patriots. Hello to our fearless president, Donald J. Trump. And hello to millions of Americans all across this land who are gathered in sadness and sorrow to mourn Charlie Kirk, but also to dedicate ourselves to finishing his mission and achieving victory in his name.
Okay, so that's the intro, and already, believe it or not, Miller has hit on one of the essential components for a fascist speech. Besides the us and them rhetoric, Jason Stanley says fascism is first and foremost a cult of the leader. And isn't it interesting, at a supposed Christian memorial service for somebody else, Miller has to start his comments by referencing our fearless president, Donald J. Trump. And this just lines up with my own working definition of fascism that I've been using in other videos. I start in the same place that Stephen Miller started in his speech and where Jason Stanley starts, with the cult of the leader. My unofficial working definition of fascism begins like this. Fascism is a strategy used by a charismatic leader to amass unchecked power and personal wealth. So right here at the start, we can see how this works. Fascism is a strategy. And when I say that, I mean, it's not really an ideology like Marxism or something similar to that. I'm viewing it more as a set of techniques, certain types of techniques that work together, and they help a charismatic leader to empower himself. And so this rally was itself one tactic in a larger fascist strategy, one that involves stirring up us versus them emotions in its listeners. But it's important that we recognize what the strategy is for. It's not about making the nation better. That's just the bait on the hook. And it's definitely not about making the nation holier, because these types of leaders historically have been some of the most self-evidently rapacious people in the world. But they use language about protecting traditional religion and culture because they know that that's the perfect bait for the hook. So this is all just a strategy, and the strategy is for the purpose of empowering and enriching the leader, and by extension, empowering and enriching the leader's family and associates, so long as they don't show disloyalty to the leader. But in order to win over the masses, fascism seems to require a charismatic leader, a skilled demagogue. And Stephen Miller knows that, and that's why I think he attached himself to Donald Trump long ago. So now Miller gets to share his message as, on one of the largest stages in the world. So let's listen some more and watch now how he panders to the Christians in his audience with some talk about angels, but he even turns that into something warlike.
The day that Charlie died, the angels wept, but those tears have been turned into fire in our hearts. And that fire burns with a righteous fury that our enemies cannot comprehend or understand. When I see Erica and her strength and her courage, I'm reminded of a famous expression. The storm whispers to the warrior that you cannot withstand my strength. And the warrior whispers back, I am the storm. Erica is the storm. We are the storm. And our enemies cannot comprehend our strength, our determination, our resolve, our passion.
So you can hear that, right? The friend-enemy distinction. I'm not going to point it out every time because he uses it a lot, but we do have to note the politics of us and them at the core of this whole message. And now the next part of my work and definition is going to come into play throughout the rest of the speech. I've written that these sorts of leaders exploit cultural grievances and stoke nationalist anxieties. And that's what Miller is going to do. He's going to capitalize on what was a true tragedy in that one of his group, the in-group, was assassinated, but he's going to stoke that grievance all the way through his message. Now, as a side note, I just have to say, it infuriates me how shamelessly these people try to link this shooter and also the shooter at Trump's rally in Butler, Pennsylvania to the left. But that is another argument for another day. So I'm just going to pretend, for the sake of argument, that both of these guys actually were leftists. What I'm addressing here is a very old tactic that Miller's going to use. What Miller's engaging in here, what he's going to engage in here is called collective guilt. And he's going to assign blame for the actions of one person onto an entire group. And then he's going to inflame the crowd's anger against that entire group. So like I said, the next section is all about exploiting cultural grievances and stoking nationalist anxieties. And he's doing that by assigning collective guilt to the other, the supposed enemies of the culture and the enemies of the true nation. And really, what you're about to hear goes beyond that. And this isn't even the worst part. He's just getting warmed up here. But let's listen.
Our lineage and our legacy hails back to Athens, to Rome, to Philadelphia, to Monticello. Our ancestors built the cities. They produced the art and architecture. They built the industry. Erica stands on the shoulders of thousands of years of warriors, of women who raised up families, raised up city, raised up industry, raised up civilization, who pulled us out of the caves and the darkness into the light. The light will defeat the dark. We will prevail over the forces of wickedness and evil. They cannot imagine what they have awakened. They cannot conceive of the army that they have arisen in all of us. Because we stand for what is good, what is virtuous, what is noble.
So let's stop here and catch our breath for a minute. Honestly, maybe this is a good time for me to say this. I just have to admit that I have trouble knowing how to even be with friends and loved ones who were able to listen to that kind of speech, who listened to all of those speeches, and they weren't disgusted and appalled by them. And some of them even called that a worship service or a revival. And I'm still trying, honestly, just to figure out how to carry on relationships with people who hear those things and just won't admit the obvious meanings. Because that's another tactic that people like Miller use. They say enough that everyone knows what he's talking about, but he makes us call it what it is. And then he claims victimhood because we dared to add up the obvious meaning of the words he used. Trump does that, Miller does that, and it's a fun game for them. And their crowd apparently loves it and plays along. So anyway, we all know what these phrases mean. Western civilization. We built this country. We're the civilized ones. And even the way he intentionally excludes the enslaved black people who did the actual work. He makes me say that. And that's just such a childish game. He talks about the civilized people who came from places like Athens and Rome and Philadelphia and Monticello. Monticello, he says, Thomas Jefferson's majestic plantation. And that's not an accident. He knows what that means, but he's making me say it. Because when I point out that Jefferson's plantation was built by enslaved people, who Miller excluded in his litany, and it was worked by enslaved people, then he knows that his dishonest followers are going to seize on my words and say that I'm making it all about race. And by bringing up Jefferson, he's tempting me to challenge the very foundations of our nation by talking about how this nation was founded by wealthy white men who owned their fellow human beings. But, that's just called history. And it's still legal to talk about history. So anyway, I'm not making this about race, Stephen Miller. You're the one who took a supposedly Christian memorial service, and you began by verbally bowing in subservience to your Lord and benefactor, Donald Trump, and then you went on a white nationalist verbal rampage against your imagined enemies. I'm not reading into your words. I'm stating what's clear and obvious. And I'd be reading into your words, I think, if I speculated that all of this is just your way of publicly working out your issues. Maybe you were stuffed in a locker in junior high, but that would be reading into it. This was a message about race and culture, plain and simple. And you're playing toddler level word games. And you did forget to mention, by the way, that this Western civilization of which you speak did give us the bloody world wars in the 20th century. And I could start going down that whole list of similar achievements. But I think you get my point. So anyway, let's continue. Let's listen to Stephen regale us with some more words about his enemies and how his enemies are trying to incite violence against the good people. Because we all know where this is going, right? These accusations that people who criticize Trump and his MAGA movement are inciting violence merely by accurately describing what that movement is doing, those accusations are what they eventually hope to use to start rounding up white people who oppose them. So here comes some more collective guilt talk and even more dehumanization of the enemy.
And to those trying to incite violence against us, those trying to foment hatred against us, what do you have? You have nothing. You are nothing. You are wickedness, you are jealousy, you are envy, you are hatred. You are nothing. You can build nothing. You can produce nothing. You can create nothing. We are the ones who build. We are the ones who create. We are the ones who lift up humanity. You thought you could kill Charlie Kirk? You have made him immortal. You have immortalized Charlie Kirk. And now millions will carry on his legacy. And we will devote the rest of our lives to finishing the causes for which Charlie gave his last measure of devotion. You cannot defeat us. You cannot slow us. You cannot stop us. You cannot deter us. We will carry Charlie and Erica in our heart every single day and fight that much harder because of what you did to us. You have no idea the dragon you have awakened.
So let's go here to the last part of my working definition of fascism: legitimizing violence against a chosen other and turning the crowd into a weapon against the institutions of democracy itself. And man, I hope that it's obvious by now how Miller's doing that in this speech. By assigning collective guilt for Charlie Kirk's death to anyone who opposes Trump, and by dehumanizing them as nothing, he's laying the groundwork for violence against them. And I'll say it personally, against us, against people like myself who are speaking out against them. They've already dehumanized brown people and immigrants for years. And Kristi Noem is already releasing stylized videos celebrating the abuse of the other, sometimes with Bible verses attached. But now they're laying the groundwork for the same things to happen to the white people who oppose this regime. And I have no doubt, sadly, that if they succeed, which again, I hope they don't, but if people don't push back loudly enough, then someday we might get to the point where when I'm taken away by ICE or the FBI or whoever, a lot of people that I've known and loved are going to say, well, shoot, he should have known better than to say that stuff. And this is how it starts.
You have no idea how determined we will be to save this civilization, to save the West, to save this republic. because our children are strong, and our grandchildren will be strong, and our children's children's children will be strong. And what will you leave behind? Nothing. Nothing. To our enemies, you have nothing to give, you have nothing to offer, you have nothing to share, but bitterness. We have beauty, we have light, we have goodness, we have determination, we have vision, we have strength. We built the world that we inhabit now, generation by generation, and we will defend this world. We will defend goodness, we will defend light, we will defend virtue. You cannot terrify us, you cannot frighten us, you cannot threaten us, because we are on the side of goodness, we are on the side of God.
And that's as much as I can take. So I'm going to cut this little guy off at this point so I can say he is not on the side of God. And those people cheering in the audience are not on the side of God. And neither are the millions of people who listened at home and dared to call this moral catastrophe a work of the Holy Spirit. I'm certain that many of the people who loved that rally will complain in a few months about Bad Bunny performing at the Super Bowl. And if Shakira gets up and shakes her hips alongside him, they'll be outraged at that too. But I'll tell you what obscenity is. Obscenity is standing up in front of a cheering throng and preaching white supremacist hate and claiming that God is on your side and having Christians across America call that a revival and a work of God and rejoice that the gospel was preached. That's what obscenity looks like. So thanks for listening.